Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Marketplace Risk Virtual Event Series. My name is Andrea, and I'm the Director of Events and Logistics here at Marketplace Risk. Today, we welcome members of the Trust and Safety Professionals Association, Donna, Cameron, Chanel, and Nicole. Our virtual events are designed to help marketplace and sharing economy startups successfully navigate complex risk management, trust and safety, compliance, and legal subject matter so that they can avoid distractions in order to focus on launching and growing. Be sure to check out marketplacerisk.com to access hundreds of hours of content, including our master's program, platform podcast, and previous live events. And to subscribe to our newsletter where we keep you up to date on everything, including the Marketplace Risk Management Conference in San Francisco and the Sharing Economy Global Summit in London. As we're gearing up for the conference in San Francisco, May 17th and 18th, we would like to offer our virtual event attendees a discounted registration. You can use code VIRTUALEVENT50, all caps, at checkout for 50% off your registration, and we hope to see you there. So everyone, thank you for tuning into today's event, Trust and Safety Policy Development, a conversation with practitioners. A couple housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded, so the recording will be available for you to access on our website. Second, all attendees have listening capabilities only and are otherwise muted. And third, do submit your questions via the control panel. If we have time at the end, we will answer as many as we can. If we don't get to your questions, feel free to email us at info@marketplacerisk.com. We'll get your questions answered. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to our presenters.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Andrea. I wanted to thank also the team at Marketplace Risk for hosting us today and for the opportunity to moderate this panel with this stellar group of policy professionals. They will introduce themselves in a minute. I am Donna Bello. By day, I support policy and responsible innovation at a social messaging startup. I previously worked in various TNS roles at some of the major platforms like Google, Airbnb, and Meta. But I'm here today because I'm also an advisor for the Trust and Safety Professional Association, also known as TSPA. And so for those of you that don't know, TSPA is a membership association that supports the global community of professionals who develop and enforce the policies and principles that define what is acceptable behavior or content on online platforms. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and give the opportunity to our amazing panelists to introduce themselves. So could you tell us your name, your pronouns, and give us a little bit of history of where you've worked before and what you do now. I think we'll go maybe in reverse alphabetical order. So we'll start with you, Nicole, and then we'll go to Chanel and then Cameron.
Sure. My name's Nicole Lopez, she, her. I am currently the head of trust and safety at OutSchool, which is an ed tech company. It's a marketplace of mostly live online classes for kids, but we also have some async groups. And in terms of my background, I am a reformed lawyer. So, and I say heavy emphasis on reform. I am trying to escape my lawyer past, although it keeps catching up with me. But I started out at a big firm, got a little jaded, became a prosecutor, did that for about 8-9 years, then moved back into civil litigation and pivoted to trust and safety about 3.5 years ago. I started out at a small startup called Zoom, which is like an Uber for kids, high risk, and then landed at OutSchool about 2 years ago. So that's my background. Yeah.
Chanel.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm Chanel Daniels, pronouns she, her. And I work at Depop, which is a fashion marketplace where it's like with a strong focus on the circular economy, where users like buy and sell used items of clothing, but also some other items as well. My current position is working as a senior manager for community safety. So that's looking after like more of the operational side, but in a previous life I worked in policy, both at for Depop as well as for Meta. And before that, I was like on the other side in terms of the public sector. So there I worked with the EU, UN, UK government, also like on a lot of different areas, but it also included consumer protection. So yeah, it's nice to have seen both sides of that regulation kind of coin.
Thank you, Chanel.
Awesome. I'm Cameron, he, him. I am the Senior Director of Content Policy at Zephyr. And what Zephyr is, it's an ad tech company that measures content on behalf of advertisers on walled gardens. So what I mean by that is TikTok, YouTube, soon to be Meta. So we are writing policies on behalf of advertisers versus being like on the platforms themselves. So that's kind of an interesting angle. I've been at Zephyr for coming up on 7 years, so our team has kind of slowly evolved into a trust and safety. This team has taken multiple been in multiple forms over the years, and it's kind of all gravitated towards a trust and safety content policy role. Before that, I was in publicity for music festivals and music content. But so my foray into policy has kind of just been growing within this role, and as this team has evolved, so has that direction gone that way.
That's awesome. I love these intros because these are why you're all here today. You have very diverse backgrounds and different experiences of what policy can look like. You've done it at different companies, like different type of platforms, non-platform government. So I'm curious to know, based on your past and current experience, what has policy looked like? What kind of policies have you worked on? And maybe we can start with you actually, Cameron, since you have a bit of a specific model with Zephyr. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the past, our policies have kind of been very sales driven. Just basically whatever type of campaign we're selling, we want to make sure that we deliver content that matches to that. So the policy has been very much whatever sales says goes. And as there's been more of an emphasis on brand safety and building products and that map to policies that are transferable and universal, the policy has kind of shifted more towards a product focused tool. And so we've, in the early days, it was very much like, hey, the policy for a brand is that they want to be in front of cars and videos that tech focused millennials like. So it's very abstract, and we would just kind of like piece together what we could. As the industry has grown, and as things like GARM and the 4As have kind of come in and taken up like leadership as far as defining what is safe and unsafe and suitable and unsuitable, we've kind of used that as our guiding light into how we develop policies that are universally applicable to all brands, so that there's not confusion between whatever platform they're advertising on, and it's not a new thing every time they start a new campaign with us. It's understood before we even get into the nitty gritty of how their campaigns are targeted and measured.
Nicole?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the exponential growth that we've seen at OutSchool. So to give you context, in terms of what policies we handle, when I joined OutSchool, we were about 35, 36 employees. We were pretty small, Series A. And in the last 2 years, we've grown to 200 plus people internally, but also our user base exploded because you can imagine, I'm a parent of 2 little kids, but during the pandemic, parents were, in a position where their schools were shutting down. They needed to distract their kids during the day to continue to work. And so there was just all of these shifts that took place, and that really changed the types of policies that we were working on very quickly and added different stressors and different just needs to our platform. So because we started getting all of these different kids on our platform and an influx of educators, we started developing policies. Of course, there were content moderation policies. And as we added more async forums, which allowed kids to upload user-generated content, that developed that part of what the trust and safety team does. And then there were a lot of policies that were born out of educators joining our platform as independent contractors and interacting with kids through Zoom in live classes. And so that invited so many policies that we had to develop to account for new users, and then a lot of tricky regulatory issues that we were also seeing. So that was another kind of basket of policies that we developed. And then there are policies that impact us that we don't necessarily write, but we have the classes that educators teach. Those are class content policies. So we have another small team that works on policies to make sure that educators are teaching appropriate content for kids, which has trust and safety implications. So we do work closely with that team. And then internally, there were all of these policies that we had to develop to make sure that we were in sync and consistent with what was external facing as well as product policies. So we work really closely in advising the product team on the features that they're developing to make sure that they are always thinking of trust and safety and ensuring that one of our values, which is standing for learners, is woven into the equation when they're expanding and developing various features. So that's kind of a range of what we touch on, but it's definitely changed in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those parents, so I'm very grateful for all the work that your team has put in.
My kids feel mixed about Outschool. They used to love it at the beginning, and now, but I appreciate that, Donna.
Chanel, did you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, so I guess for me, the policies have been much more, probably more in that kind of social media type space. Like, I mean, obviously when you think of like companies like Meta, but then also even with where I'm working now, which is it's a marketplace, so you do have that set of rules that are concerned with kind of what you're allowed to sell, how you're allowed to sell, what's expected of you as a kind of good and trusted seller or buyer, but then also because it's what is termed now as being like more of a social marketplace. People talk to each other about style. People comment a lot about what is there, what has been posted. People actually make friends through the platform after connecting about like something shared passion, like some kind of shared passion related to an item that was on the platform. So it is also, those kind of very kind of, like the standard kind of challenges that you could have when users are messaging each other as well. And thinking about this both in terms of the, like the kind of like the bigger issues and the bigger things that we'll cover kind of quite a lot, but then also in the past as well, I've also been working on some very specific, sometimes very, sometimes very kind of localized issues, and actually needing to be able to create a response to that, which might be counterintuitive when you think about what would work on a global scale or what we would even expect, but actually because of the nature of a very particular situation, you do need to be able to have like a very appropriate response to that to ensure safety that might not be suitable outside of that situation or in another locality as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chanel. I love that you outline this idea that like, yeah, we create policies, but they would have to think about, the trickle down effect, like at the local level, right? And how that applies. So great. So we've talked about different types of policies. You've obviously are operating on very different platforms or for different platforms alongside different platforms. But it seems still that there are some similarities in the way that policies are developed in the actual like policy formation process. So maybe this is a bit of a vague and complex question, but what does good policy craft look like to you? Like, how do you know that you've done a good job writing a policy? And I'm going to pass it over to you, Chanel, because you also have the intersection of working in ops, and I know that the relationship there is definitely important. So would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think, it's a very interesting question, because definitely when I first started in this area. And I think that, and it's also probably comparable to government. It's kind of like a good policy is when you get good feedback, or in government, it could be like this becomes like something that somebody can get elected on, or these kind of things. Generally, it's kind of like, yeah, it's good policies when everyone loves it. And then actually now working from that other side being like, you know, it's great that everyone loves this, but we can't actually enforce this. This is not something that actually works when you think about the day-to-day job of an agent, or the processes that you have to go through, or the tools that everyone has to use, which is always very company specific as well. And so I'm definitely in a point where it's like, I'm not even sure what would necessarily make a good policy. I'm definitely thinking very much about something that's enforceable, but I do remember definitely being on the other side, and where I spent, you know, a long time working on something that I considered a masterpiece, and, you know, expert review, for example, would say this is great, and it kind of went through all the different internal stakeholders, and then when ops would say kind of, you know, come back and be like, we can't enforce this, it's like, well, change what you're doing. This is an amazing policy. Yeah. So yeah, sometimes you have the piece, you know, you've written it out, and it's almost like you want to just print and frame this, and it's like, my wording is perfect, and we've been able to distinguish between these kind of the exceptions that we might want to leave up to prevent over enforcement, and that's great. But yeah, sometimes it's more that's nice art, piece of artwork. Now let's like, what is the actual impact it can make? So yeah, I guess it's not an easy question for me to answer right now. So yeah, I'm happy to pass on to see other views.
Well, Chanel, I was actually, so enforceability immediately came to mind, but related to what you're saying, I have a couple of ideas specific to OutSchool, but scalability too. So like when you're talking about a policy that's well written and how it relates to ops, I can think of a specific example on our platform. I think examples are helpful sometimes to just anchor it. But, you know, we had a problem at OutSchool where for trust and safety reasons, when you start a class, just like we're all on video, we want our educators on our platform to verify that kids are joining the classroom and not adults posing as kids. You can imagine the risks that are there of adults pretending to be kids, getting access to kids, right? It's a serious issue. But then you're balancing that. So from a policy standpoint, you know, we thought, well, we want to make sure that kids who may be shy or maybe have, you know, learning disabilities, or just like don't want to turn their camera on, or maybe can't afford a camera. I mean, there are a lot of situations that kids come from, and we want to make sure that they are kids, but also can participate in class. So one of the policies that we developed that has an operational component to it was allowing kids to meet with my team and to be validated as a kid, right, through a Zoom, to make sure that they're a kid and they're associated with the account. And when we rolled it out, I thought, great policy, love it, but is it scalable? You know, when I joined, I was a team of one woman with one counterpart who joined me. Now my team is much bigger, but how could we accommodate kids while ensuring, you know, that like we're on all day and making appointments to meet with kids and doing all of the right things on that side? And so I always think of scalability. You may want to make a change, you may want to do the right thing, but if you can't support it internally, whether it's through product or on the ops side, that's going to cause issues. So I think that to us is important. The other thing I was thinking about too, related to enforceability in that is, you know, when I started out, we had some policies in place, but as we started seeing more and more issues and tracking data, right? So there's a real relationship to data on our platform. We started tracking these trends and seeing where the issues were. And the one size fits all for some, I mean, I think some platforms are very differently situated than us, but we couldn't just crib policies from other platforms and use them as ours. That did not work. We are niche. We have a lot of complex issues that are facing us. We have privacy issues, trust and safety issues that relate to, you know, lots of CSAM potential issues, like stuff that's specific to our platform. And then we have educators who are independently contracting on our platform. So there are all of these moving pieces. And when we evaluated what policies we needed to add to our arsenal, it was not only enforceability and scalability, but they needed to be really tailored to our product. They needed to be tailored to the issues that we're seeing, and they needed to be written in ways that were really specific to our values as well. And so part of me wanted to take the easy way out at the beginning and just do whatever I could to take good policies, what I viewed as good policies, and use them as ours, and that just couldn't work. So that's something I think of. And then the last thing I was going to say was that policies need to be well written, but a policy, just having a policy written doesn't mean that it gets read. And so the policy can be crisp, it can read beautifully, but unless you're proactively taking that policy and feeding it to people in ways where they're going to listen and understand your expectations, you're not going to get compliance. And you need to serve it up to people in ways where it's heard. And so I think part of good policy craft is not just writing it in a way that's going to be successful at, telling people what your expectations are so that they comply, but getting it to them in a way where they really internalize it, and in ways that don't impact growth and don't impact your product in like negative ways. So I think it's tricky, but that was the other thought I had was, proselytizing your policies is part of what makes it good on the back end of it.
Yeah, those were a lot of very good points. Thank you for sharing that, Nicole. Did you want to chime in, Cameron, or do you feel like everything's been said?
No, I think you both covered like some main points in how we see good policy craft. Because in our scenario where we're working with platforms but also advertisers and kind of balancing appeasing both of them and making sure that we're not favoring one over the other too much. I kind of chuckled when you said policy craft, Chanel, when you said policy craft was when everybody's really excited and happy about it, because it's kind of the opposite for us. It's when nobody puts up a stink about it. It's when it like, okay, like everybody's cool with this and nobody's, there's no major complaints coming, then that's good policy craft for us. We have a policy challenge system where we like open ourselves up to feedback, where it's like, you guys, if someone's like, hey, this seems like really bad policy, we want to hear that because we want to be constantly evolving, because these platforms are constantly evolving. Another way we kind of consider, there's like when we're in the development phase of policy, there's a gut instinct to like, we're usually rooting that policy in a specific example, like that's come up from an advertiser or from the platform or whatever the hot button issue of the day is, and there's an impulse to write policy that addresses that specific example. But the danger of that is that you got to play the kind of the what about game. So there's something that comes up and you're like, oh, I can define this really well. But if we just lock that in, because if you can dream it, it exists on TikTok or YouTube or on the social platforms. So like we basically do an exercise of thinking up hypothetical examples that could counteract that would say, oh, well, if I say that alcohol content is any presence of alcohol in the video, you're like, hey, that makes sense. But then you're like, well, what about a baseball game and you see someone in the background with a beer? It's like, well, that's not really capturing the spirit of what you're trying to capture. So we kind of just play this what about game as much as we can until we settle on a policy where it's like, you can't really edit, you can always sort of find a counter example, but it's like, that feels like such an outlandish example that we're not worried about it until we do see it. So good policy craft is, in my eyes, is not being able to, it's impossible to like for sure validate that this policy is going to be perfect when it's implemented. So do as many rounds of the what about or challenge, throwing stuff at it and seeing like, does that work? Does that work? Does that work? And then you know, from our, and in actuality, what good policy craft for us looks like is everybody going like, yeah, that makes sense, and not raising a stink or not setting up a big fire drill about how, you know, how could we possibly label this content this way? This makes no sense. So if we can just avoid those like nightmare scenarios, then the policy at a high level has done its job in our eyes.
That's great. I noted down that absence of reaction is a success metric, so I will take that with me from my own policy development. So thank you for sharing that. So we brought up a lot of good points, but we also know that, and I know some of you had this experience before, of sometimes you're the one person within the company who's writing all the policies, right? And you're super strapped for time because you also have other things that you have to take care of. So what would you say are sort of like maybe 3, 4, 5 like must-do steps that you have to stick to in order to get the policy work done? Anybody can chime in.
Well, I can. Oh, Chanel, go for it. Go for it.
I thankfully haven't been the only person like working on policy in the smaller company. I thankfully joined like after that level, but it was but one thing I am just definitely more conscious of being in a smaller company than in a larger company about is like how significant it is to kind of have the agent feedback on the different issues when working on the policy, and actually being able to kind of have people that are on the front line of dealing with complaints being part of that journey. I think we spend a lot of time talking to experts and different things, and I think in larger companies, that's kind of where a lot of the focus is. It's about kind of getting that external stamp of approval. But I think that like nobody knows a community better than the people who are actually having to deal with like the complaints that are coming in, and also the frustrations of not being able to kind of respond in a way that they think we should respond. And I think like, yeah, just being able to find ways to facilitate that kind of feedback and consultation internally is super critical. I'd say it's critical for all companies, but I think I realized just how valuable it becomes at smaller entities as well. That's one. So now I'll pass it over.
Chanel, I was going to say that having people in the trenches and collecting that data especially is critical. And my team actually, like, we do ops and policy hand in hand. And I know other companies separate. I mean, the bigger you get, the more narrow your swim lane is. But I work very closely with my colleagues who are handling incidents as they develop to help inform what policies we should be developing. So that's been incredibly influential. I was also going to say that bringing in experts has been a fundamental part of our policy writing, especially when we're dealing, again, in niche areas. So for example, during the pandemic, we saw child abuse reporting skyrocketed on our platform, where kids were home. We all know that the domestic violence rates went up, mental health issues were increasing, and kids were suddenly yanked from their schools. And normally they would confide in their teachers in person, or teachers would see that there was child abuse going on at home. Now, all of a sudden, kids were on our platform and they were, either reporting to teachers or reporting in Zoom chat that there was child abuse in different ways. And I used to prosecute child abuse cases, so I knew the lay of the land, but I wasn't a mandated reporter. And I was trying to figure out, our team was trying to figure out, how do we deal with this uptick? What kind of policy do we want to have in place? And so, we worked with experts to better understand how we should address this with our educator community, because we relied on them to report to us. And in developing those policies, I think reaching out to the right people was just fundamental to the policy being successful. And when policies are tricky and nuanced, and they also touch on legal or privacy issues, you want to make sure that you're aligned with those stakeholders in your company to make sure that you get it right, because those ramifications can be huge. So that's the other thing I would say is, you want to issue spot what other stakeholders you have to bring in the first instance before you start crafting the policy, so that you really understand that how you shape it is done correctly. So that's the other add.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're coming at it at a very different, like what you're describing sounds super high stakes, and what we're doing is I mean, not that ours isn't high stakes, but it's
Yeah, your work is just as important, Cameron.
Yeah, but it's policy for advertisers. So when we're crafting policy, we're kind of almost interpreting someone else's idea, whether that's GARM, who's laying out suitability frameworks, or if it's, we're trying to develop a universal policy for what is news content, what is kids content, that type of stuff. We're trying to like tap into the brains of a bunch of different people that have all their own interpretations of what this type of content is. And so the first step is to kind of like, get as much raw like feedback as we can of like, okay, what do you guys think this is? And that involves talking to people who have direct relationships with those brands and stuff. So we also our first step is to like get all of that kind of raw data, if you will, and think about it. Okay, what's this actual policy supposed to capture? What's the, going back to my theme earlier of like what offends the least number of people? When we're thinking about news, like, okay, what's the best version of news that works for as many of these brands as possible? And then the second step is kind of getting really small. So that's like getting really big with it and trying to get as much stuff in. And then the next step is to get really small. So we have a team of 8 right now, and part of our day-to-day is constantly reviewing new content. It serves a couple different purposes, but from a policy perspective, it's basically a check of the policy that's happening every single day. And so if when we're writing that policy, it's important to not only think about what brands all over the world are thinking about, but when we write it, is this enforceable? Is this understood within our own team, within the small group that we have? Like if we write it and then the people on my team don't understand it or can't make sense of it, then it's not effective policy, because if we don't understand it, certainly no one else is going to understand. So it's like taking a bunch of different people's individual ideas, kind of forming consensus, and then honing in on, all right, how can we actually make this actionable for like a single piece of content, while keeping the big picture in mind.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, because that's a great segue into my next question, which is about collecting input. Because from my experience, you guys touch on that as well. We can't really build effective policies if we're just building them in a vacuum, right? Like we need to understand the business values, like we need to understand the platform trends, get data points, but also get those like external and internal perspectives. So it's a bit of a two-part question. One, how do you handle sort of like the number of internal stakeholders and opinions that come from them, especially when you're looking at people who are in other parts of the company or even the leadership chain sometimes that they don't have a lot of familiarity with the space, right? So how do you manage that? And then the second thing is, how do you decide when you've done enough of this collecting and incorporating, and you decide that, okay, the policy is in a good place enough that we can ship it out?
I think like, so one of the example that we've kind of tangled with recently is building a way to label content for, is this about happiness? Which, boy, oh boy, is that an abstract idea, especially not happiness for like a individual viewer, but how do brands think about happiness? So we wanted to collect how like what we were hearing from marketing, like what the appetite was, how brands are coming to us being like, hey, we want to be advertising around and measure advertising around this type of content. And And it's not a very human it's like, it's weird. It's a brand focused definition. It's not a human focused definition. So we were really struggling with how to craft a policy around that, because ultimately it's just a bunch of humans enforcing that, but it's almost like a completely separate idea of, you know, in a brand's perspective, to make it tangible, happiness is like flash mobs and like soldiers returning home from war and dogs seeing their owner for, like, it's a very specific set of things. It's not, does this video make you happy? Because, you know, if I'm watching my team, a highlight of my team winning a game from last night, that's going to make me happy. But a person who's on the losing team is going to actively make them sad. So there's, anyway, I'm getting lost in the analogy here, but it basically is all about collecting, like, you know, all of those different inputs, but then also talking with our product team of like, all right, how do we actually, and our data science team, like, how do we actually do anything with this? Because if it's not rooted in, if it's entirely a brand identified construct, in this case, how can we actually do anything with this? Because if we can't do anything with it, it's as good as nothing. So I'm mostly just presenting the challenge of it. I'm not really giving any answers, but I think the best, you know, the way that we've kind of landed on things is just to collect as much as stuff as you can, and then at a certain point you'll go, okay, like it's basically about getting a clearer picture. And every time you collect a little bit more information, that picture of what kind of policy you need to write, in our case, gets a little bit clearer, to the point where you kind of can start writing stuff, throw it again, you know, throw the spaghetti against the wall, see what sticks, and then just kind of rinse and repeat. And eventually, you know, in our case, it'll be like, okay, this works. Everybody's satisfied. We can execute on it. It tackles the needs that are coming from the stakeholders. In that case, in our case, being brands, actually. And yeah, it's just kind of that process of collect, try stuff, see what works, collect, and just keep rinse and repeat until that it's clear.
Thank you. I know, Nicole, you were going to jump in as well, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'm coming from the position, again, OutSchool is about 200 some people, so we're much smaller, and things have changed where writing policy was much cleaner and easier at the beginning because there just weren't as many bodies, right? And then as we started growing, I viewed, you know, one of our tenets is bringing others in, but I like having people get involved and be curious about our trust and safety policies, because part of my role is to build consensus where I can. And I want to get allies. I mean, I'm not trying to sound strategic here, because that's not, you know, but in a way it is somewhat strategic. There's friction with trust and safety. I mean, nobody's mentioned this yet, I don't think, but there's inherent friction with trust and safety and growth and product at most companies. I can only speak to OutSchool. But you don't want to be viewed as slowing things down. You want people to support your policies. And so when people ask questions about policies, whether it's over Slack or, you know, a policy that we're thinking about writing, I want to bring them in. The second part of your question, though, is at what point is there too much noise, right? Because you have so many different points of views, and you don't want it to overwhelm the process, and it gets tricky. And so what I can say is that my approach is there's some policies that are really straightforward and don't require people to weigh in. And there are fewer and fewer of those. The policies where people want to get involved and they may be relevant, they may not, we invite them to weigh in and to comment and to get involved. But then at a certain point, there's certain stakeholders who are critical to how the policy is written and to how it's carried out. And so part of our job is to, when we're thinking through what the policy is going to look like, identifying who those stakeholders are and documenting it when we're writing a PRD, or figuring out what the policy is going to look like, so that everybody is aware in the beginning what their role is. What's been surprising to me is that sometimes people who are not necessarily identified as the key stakeholders have really great ideas. and weigh in on policies in ways that are unexpected and that then kind of shift the policy a little bit, but that's part of the fun. So I don't know if that answers the first and second parts, but I'll hand it to you, Chanel, in case there's anything you want to add.
I guess for me, like, I guess, and this is where like one of the areas where the kind of experience in the public sector becomes very helpful, because with the policies I've worked on there, like things have to go for very wide consultation. Like consultation can be public, and then you're managing and trying to navigate this and present this to, say, for example, a minister who doesn't have a background and has very limited time, which can compare to the executives at companies too. And I think that it's in terms of like, I think one of the things that I did develop a discipline for was really being able to think like, who is this policy designed to protect, and who are the people that are going to be most impacted by its successes or its failures. And that could be, for example, if you think about something like hate speech, this could be, for example, like, you know, this could be designed to protect people with, you know, what's under human rights we call like protected characteristics, whether this is kind of race or gender identity or, you know, whatever. And the people that are going to be impacted would include the people who are obviously going to be the most protected by this policy. You probably need this policy the most to kind of help improve their life experience. But it would also include the people that have been caught out with this problem before, and what has worked well and what in terms of moving them to a place of being able to align with this type of behavior as well. And like, so it's also kind of, it's trying to be able to map all of those reactions. And then at that time so this will include, yeah, like the people that will be very for this policy, maybe some people that will be against this policy, but really being able to understand this first. And then when you kind of have all of these different views across the kind of extremes or the spectrum, then it's really being about whose voice matters the most here, right? Like, because then it's, if you're going back to the hate speech example, if this is a policy that is designed for this group of people, their voice has to have more weight than somebody who would not have a protected characteristic, but might just feel strongly about it because they've been influenced by this before. Like, it's good to know what they think, but it's not an equal voice. And sometimes as well, like even if you're thinking internally within a company or including in government, if something's being discussed in a parliament, seniority doesn't mean that you know this and you know this more than anyone else, and that your voice should be heard more than, for example, people that would be most affected by this policy. And that's can be something that's quite challenging to be working with, both in the public sector and as well, I think it's comparable in a company. And I think sometimes this is especially the case because I think the nature of tech is that, you know, the majority of the companies tend to be based in the US, were founded in the US, and still probably have a very strong staff presence of like US recruitment, but actually they could be making a policy for, you know, Somalia. No one that's in that kind of leadership team that's signing that off has experience and really understands what this policy will mean for somebody that's based in Somalia, right? So it's also about, like, I think trying to be able to articulate why you need to balance that, and then if you kind of get that buy-in, like really being able to kind of have a process where people are really thinking to make sure that it's, you know, it is trying to kind of, yeah, like trying to really make sure that the right voices are being heard at the right volume.
Yeah, I feel like we need a separate webinar about like deciding which voices matter, especially in the current context in our industry, right? And the questions around are companies even in the best position to be the decider of that, right? So yeah, that's absolutely a fascinating point, and definitely something that we all have to contend with when trying to navigate these trade-offs. So I wanted to actually jump back on the point that you started bringing up, Nicole, around sort of like the internal dynamics of this work. And so I've personally become very interested and involved in the field of responsible innovation because it's all about sort of like embedding some of these practices and solutions that trust and safety cares about, like into the way that products are built, because it's often the case that content moderation and policy are sort of like afterthoughts of the interest of products and user growth. And that definitely has impact on the work of the trust and safety teams, right? Sort of like dealing with the downstream effects of that. So I'm curious to know if there are effective ways that you've had to advocate for the interest of policy, content moderation, embedding safety mechanisms early in the life cycle of product development. And I know, Nicole, since you started bringing that up, I'm going to pass it to you because I think you have thoughts on this.
I do. I have strong thoughts. Like containing myself. All right, a couple of thoughts. So again, my perspective, like I'm relatively new to trust and safety. It's 3.5 years that I've been doing it, but my work as a prosecutor, it ties into the work that I'm doing now in that I saw really bad stuff. I wouldn't say that I'm jaded, but I'm coming from a very different perspective, right? Like I was doing gang wiretap cases and, you know, sex assaults and child abuse and working closely with victims. And it's a lot. And I know that people see this in content moderation land and they're exposed to it. So anyway, but, you know, when I joined OutSchool and even to this day, that perspective was not shared in the either on the product side or just generally at the company. Everybody's coming from very different backgrounds. And so getting people to take, everybody takes safety very seriously at our company, but in a way, a lot of the work that we do, it's almost like a hypothetical threat. If you do a good job at proactively deterring and mitigating trust and safety issues, whether it's on the ops side or policy side, you don't fully understand the risk vectors. And so there was a period where product and trust and safety was not working well together. And it was like two ships passing each other in the night. And so what I started doing was, and this gets back to my earlier point, Donna, about like when you're short on time and you're at a scrappy startup, where do you go? Who do you talk to? And so I reached out. I reached out to a much bigger company and befriended, you know, some people in privacy and content moderation land at that company. And I picked their brains, signed NDAs, talk to them. How do you deal with these issues in content moderation land when you're dealing with kids under 13 and they're sharing data and over 13, and what does that look like on the product side? And over time, they explained to me how they developed their you know, privacy by design setup. So I went back to my company and it took time, but I did my research and spoke with enough stakeholders, and slowly we built out our own, you know, trust by design framework. And it's been great because it now, and I know a lot of bigger companies have this, so I'm preaching to the choir, but for the smaller companies, it's a terrific way to reach product so early on in the process when it's just the ideas are flowing, where they bring you in informally and start discussing with the relevant stakeholders. So for us, it's InfoSec. It used to be just Nicole when I was running legal and privacy and trust and safety, but we hired a new head of legal. She's amazing. We hired a privacy lead. Also, she's amazing. And our head of infra engineering, amazing. So we have this quartet of women, and we advise the product team early on what they're thinking of developing. So that's a way to kind of get in there. The other point I would make in terms of not making content moderation or trust and safety policy an afterthought is really using real world examples to bring to product. And that's, you know, I think showing what other companies did as best practices was persuasive. So that was something that I used. And then using worst case scenarios, being opportunistic, saying this company did XYZ and this is where it landed them. FTC investigated them. They paid X amount in fines. let's not make that mistake. And I think if you can tie the specifics of what you're envisioning on product and tie it to what has gone wrong with other companies, that's powerful. So that's the other point. And then I think generally with, one area that there's been friction is, like, what do we allow kids under 13 to share on our platform? And so something that, product always wants more, trust and safety always wants less, right? So we're not necessarily seeing eye to eye for young kids. But what's been helpful to me is really keeping track of the data and looking at user sentiment over our policies. And if you can capture that and show that our policies that product is working with are not resulting in churn or resulting in negative reactions to our platform, and that people actually feel safer because of the policies that we're developing, if you can tie that in, I think that is also a compelling way to make trust and safety not an afterthought, and that we're actually like working together to keep people on our platform and to keep people happy on our platform. So those are the nuggets. It's still working itself out. It's nowhere near perfect, but I do feel like we've made significant changes for the better.
Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. For the sake of time, I have one last question, but I did want to give either Chanel or Cameron the opportunity to chime in on this one, if you have anything you want to add as well.
Sorry, go ahead, Cameron.
Okay. Sorry. So I'll be real quick. So I think that I wish that I had heard what you just said, Nicole, earlier than today. I think that we're lucky at Zephyr because Zephyr does a good job of putting our policies, we have to, because we're the content expert company and we're the content experts within the company. The thing that I wish I could go back and tell myself in the past is to not it's good, but it's also a double-edged sword. And I wish that I had taken the time to go, let's understand, let's take our time with this. There's always from product, there's always let's build it. What can we do? We kind of became a bottleneck at a certain point, especially when we started working with TikTok, to be like, okay, what's the stuff? And we weren't experts at that time. So I think that the lesson that I would impart on past self is to take the time to actually take your time, and that's okay. And in a world where taking your time isn't always appreciated or applauded, I think it's critical in policy development, because otherwise you're just guessing. Yeah.
Chanel, did you want to say something quick?
Yeah, sure. I guess the only thing I was thinking about was how, I definitely do agree with Nicole and Cameron. I think there's a lot of ways where it's complementary, like what product's aims are and what the trust and safety aims are, and how that's embedded within a company. I would say, though, there are definitely cases that I've experienced before where it is about a trade-off. And I think that this has to be something which I see has to be a real part of the company culture and really embedded from the top down. Also to kind of ensure that a product manager that is trying to work towards their success metrics isn't going to be harmed by the fact that, whatever they were over to launch only resulted in X amount of growth, not a potential kind of much higher number. I think this is something that I think it's going to be interesting to see, at least for businesses that do have a large presence in the UK or the EU. It'll be interesting to see how forthcoming legislation that is affecting the UK and EU is going to have on the culture of companies and how they do see trust and safety, because this is really about at least with the UK legislation as it's drafted now, they can ask a company to stop operations if they feel like they need to be able to ensure safety. There has to be a pause on the company operating, or the platform allowing users to do whatever activity. So it's an interesting thing, because for the license to operate, you actually do have to be able to embed this across everything a company is doing, which does include how your product features work as well. But yeah, I just feel like it's an interesting time to be looking at that challenge, I think.
Thank you. I know that we wanted to have a little bit of time for questions. So very quickly, I'm going to ask each one of you, for those people in the room who are watching and wondering, okay, like I'm learning policy on the job right now, and I'm trying to do my best, or I want to get into this field. What would be one skill or a quality attitude that you think is very critical to be able to do this work well? For me, it's very much about checking my ego at the door, because I will be challenged, I will be wrong, revisions, all of that happen, and I've learned that. So curious to know, what is the one skill that you would recommend to have?
Oh, I have one. I would say, kind of like what you said, is embracing debate. Like the reason I love this type of work is I just love like getting in, debates, not from a heated perspective, but from an academic and thought perspective. So I think that, and then, sorry, I'm going to do two. Also, trying to build as many perspectives as you can. I think the reason our team at Zephyr is really good, is suited to become, we kind of became the policy and the trust and safety team because of where we were before, is because we worked with product, we worked with marketing, we worked with sales, we worked with ops. And when we had all of them, because we had all those perspectives, we were able to write good policy that we know what everybody else is thinking a little bit.
Oh, I think we
Chanel.
lost Chanel.
Oh, there she is.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I went to business me.
So quickly, go ahead, Chanel, maybe with your one skill.
I would say, like, you really do need to be comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty and charting new territory, because even if you've done this at another company before, you'll be going into, if you're moving into like anywhere else, the community will be very different, the type of risk will be very different, how those risks manifest will be different, and there isn't a guidebook that you can follow. You can ask other companies how they've responded to something similar, but there will always be characteristics that are not applicable, which could be the make or break for your response to that particular problem as well. So I think, yeah, it's definitely, it's not an area, I think, if you are very focused on, like, following a set structure and following a set kind of path to an outcome.
Absolutely, yeah. Nicole?
So many to list. I like the checking ego at the door. It's definitely true. I think building relationships is critical. And when I say building relationships, I mean really understanding your audience and listening to them so that you can act accordingly and be persuasive and opportunistic and find your way through those nuances in the gray area that Chanel was talking about. I think without those relationships, it's hard to be successful because you need to build a certain amount of trust for, again, we're going back to what you said, Chanel, the trade-offs. If you don't have that trust in those relationships, it impacts your ability to succeed.
Oh yeah, I definitely couldn't plus one that enough. Well, thank you all for this conversation. Andrea, I know we have like maybe a minute left. I don't know if you have time to take one question, let us know, but maybe we can from the audience.
Yeah, let's take one. How do you handle informing users of adding new guidelines to your community guidelines?
So I can jump in. It depends on how critical the changes are. If it's something that we have researched and think is going to impact how users interface with us in ways that would create problems for like the CX team or the trust and safety team, and it's going to add volume, then we'll be more proactive in either emailing or we'll have a pop-up to our users to let them know that we've made changes. Sometimes there are also like legal reasons why we have to update our terms of service or like a COPPA notice, and then that requires a little bit more. So that's one way that we do that.
I would say,
Awesome.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
no,
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say as well, like, I mean, we do have a very engaged and very vocal community, and they will definitely be making it known when they think that something has gone through without sufficient warning and things. But one thing I am aware of in this space is that it's actually very difficult to get people to read the policies. Like,
Yes.
clearly everyone wants to know the policies, but in reality, even not that many people want to be able to read it. And I think, like, when we released a kind of batch of like policies, we did actually have some really cool videos where people that are like community members are actually explaining, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, like in a kind of more macro way. And I thought that was actually, I thought that was very interesting. It was a great approach, and it's just, and they were also entertaining videos to watch as well. But again, like, I mean, I'm not sure if that actually made more people think, I really should read more about that policy before I post something, or when their content is taken down, before I get angry, let me just double check that I was actually behaving appropriately or doing what was allowed.
I don't want to end this on a dud answer, but we mostly just kind of tap in with our marketing department and just try to communicate it externally in newsletters and things like that. But so nothing quite as exciting as what you two have on your end. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, well, thank you all. It was great being able to be on this panel and get your knowledge. I've even taken notes for myself. So it's been amazing. And yeah, Andrea, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone, to our participants for taking the time, and to everyone else for joining us today. As a reminder, check out themarketplacerisk.com to access this recording along with hundreds of hours of content, and to subscribe to our newsletter and stay up to date on all events. Again, we hope everyone can join us at the Marketplace Risk Management Conference in San Francisco, May 17th and 18th. Again, you can use code virtual event 50, all caps, and 50 for 50% off your registration. And if anyone has any questions, please contact us, info@marketplacerisk.com, and we'll get your questions answered. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.